The BBC's Ceefax service is the world's first comprehensive system of teletext. That is, the display on your television screen of all kinds of information in words and diagrams.
Ceefax, a name manufactured from Seeing Facts.
The service will be carried unnoticed on one or other of the BBC channels. At the switch of a button, at any moment, any of 32 pages of information can be selected, and they can be printed on the screen in less than 15 seconds.
And when boring programs are on, and provided you have the right equipment, you can enter into an entirely new world of computerized information to do with share prices, timetables, and houses for sale.
A revolution in communication, and one that will reach straight into the home through that familiar piece of furniture, the television set.
In 1974, a brand new technology called Teletext was being rolled out. It would, over the next few decades, have far-reaching implications, not only in the UK but worldwide. Developed by the BBC, the world's first teletext service would be dubbed Ceefax. Ian Morton Smith was one of the first salaried employees of this fledgling service.
I always wanted to be a journalist. It ran in my family, and I was working as a chief sub-editor on the Middlesex Chronicle newspaper, which was part of the Surrey Comic Group. And I'd been there for about a year and a half, and it wasn't a particularly interesting area or a particularly interesting job being a chief sub on the Middlesex Chronicle. And I picked up something called the UK Press Gazette, which was the trade magazine for journalism, one day, and I was flicking through it, and there was an advert there for BBC Ceefax. Now, I hadn't got a clue what Ceefax was, nobody had at that point, but it had the magical three letters BBC in front of it, and I really fancied working for the BBC, so I applied for the job.
Ian Irving was also among the pioneering group of early Ceefax journalists.
I had a background in newspapers, and at the time I was working at the Press Association in Fleet Street, which is, as you know, a news agency. And I'd been there about 8 years, I think. And although it was a good job and I did quite well there, it was getting a bit monotonous. And I happened to see a BBC advertising, people wanted for this new technology, Teletext, Ceefax. So I thought that would be a brilliant change from what I was doing, so I applied.
Ian Morton Smith.
And I got interviewed by the editor of Ceefax, a guy called Colin McIntyre, who I clicked with immediately. He was a lovely man, a very experienced journalist, and it was like he pulled the curtains open and showed me the future. He interviewed me on the 6th floor of Television Centre in an apparatus room where he had one teletext terminal set up and a teletext television. And he showed me teletext, and it was basically words on a screen. And I said, well, where's the television picture? He said, it's behind it. And I asked him to explain it, and he explained how teletext worked technically. He said, teletext has come out of the research department at Kingswood Warren down in Surrey. There is spare bandwidth in the television signal. It's a 625 line signal, but they don't use all 625 lines to broadcast the television picture. There's something called the vertical blanking interval, and that's when the little dot that makes up the picture that goes from the top right to the bottom left of the screen whizzes back to the top to start the next scan. And the research department people said, well, we ought to be able to do something with that spare capacity. We could put subtitles for the hard of hearing in that area. So they developed teletext as a concept initially to provide subtitles for the hard of hearing. And having done that, they said, well, we're not going to use all the capacity just for subtitles for the deaf. We could do something else with it. And Colin got involved at that point, and he said, well, we could provide a news service, effectively a digital news service, long before digital was a buzzword. And that's how teletext started. It was basically Colin's idea to use that spare bandwidth, not only for the deaf, but also as a general news service. And he showed it to me, and I just loved the idea. It really got to me, and I thought, this is magical. It's going to be so fast. We can do so many things with it.
In a specially built newsroom on the 7th floor, an embryonic Ceefax editorial unit has taken shape under the guidance of a journalist editor, Colin McIntyre.
Well, I was the first editorial person brought into Ceefax, and I operated in those days from sort of broom cupboard in Television Centre, and used to go down to Kingswood Warren, which is the BBC's research department, where all these magnificent boffins were working away on projects of 10, 15 years ahead. And one of the things, of course, they were working on was trying to get subtitles for the deaf. And that really is how Teletext began, in the search for subtitling for the deaf. A lot of people really did scoff. They said, oh, just as another engineer's solution looking for a problem. There was certainly, you know, at the beginning we had sort of two viewers, and I used to ring them both up on the telephone and find out how they're getting on. But eventually, sets began to be made, and it began to move.
I had an interview with Colin McIntyre, which frankly I can hardly remember, but I think it was at Television Centre. Sometime later, I had a postcard from Colin saying as long as I hadn't been a member of Hitler Youth or Communist League in my past, the job was mine. That was a very unorthodox thing for Colin to have done, by the way, because as I later discovered, when you're applying for a journalistic job at the BBC, they run a background check on you, which you're not supposed to know about. So if there's anything dodgy in your past, you get blacklisted. However, I got past that hurdle. That's how I got to Ceefax. I was, I think, a week or two after Mort. So, you know, it's one of the first news subs there.
So I left the interview having said, you know, I was really keen on the idea. And at the time, I think I had been offered another job by Nat Druitt and Son, who owned the Middlesex Chronicle. And I told Colin that. And I got a postcard from him about 3 days after that saying, unless you turn out to be an Albanian irredentist, and I had to look up that in the dictionary to find out what an irredentist was. It's a rebel, basically. He said, you will be offered a job as a journalist working on Ceefax, so don't take any other ones. And sure enough, I got a letter about a week after that offering me the job as the first full-time journalist working on Ceefax, apart from Colin. And I went into Television Centre, and it was just unbelievable. Working in an area where I'd never been before, working in television, with all the glamour that has going with it, but doing something that virtually nobody else in the building understood. And it was an extraordinary learning experience. When we first started, a teletext page consists of 24 rows and 40 characters horizontally. So you're very limited in what you can actually write in terms of a news story. And I reckon that is the best training a journalist could ever have, because you have to encapsulate a story in about 80 words. You have to be concise and you have to be accurate. And initially there was only a single page in the broadcast system. After a while they developed rolling pages so that you can actually have page 1 of 3, page 2 of 3, page 3 of 3. And that meant you could actually run a story on a bit. But even then you had to effectively have a first paragraph that summarised the story, because people might come in on the second page and they wouldn't have seen the first paragraph. So you almost had to reproduce it in a slightly different form. And that was great training. From being the only journalist, Colin then interviewed for 4 sub-editors, of which I was one, and 4 research assistants. So the initial Ceefax full complement, if you like, was 8 people plus Colin. And we were still based up on the 6th floor.
Well, it was mainly news, but I think we all did all sorts of things. So I think we turned our hand to almost anything, but it would have been mainly news and finance and sport.
And the way that Teletext got on air at that point was you'd actually create a page on a VDU screen, and when you were happy with it and you proofread it, You pushed a button and it ran off a punched tape. You grabbed the punched tape, ran down 2 flights of stairs to the transmission area, put it in a tape reader, pushed another button, and having selected which page number you wanted it to go on, from 1 to 24, because there were only 24 pages, is watch the tape whiz through, grab it, run back upstairs and look at it on air, and then discover you'd made a spelling mistake and you had to do the whole blooming thing again. But it was real state-of-the-art stuff. Nobody had done it before, and it was great fun. It was just so exciting because it was so fast.
All sorts of things could go wrong. The tape punch could tear the tape and make it unreadable, so you'd have to do it all over again. There's all sorts of things like that which one had to get used to, but that system was only temporary. And at that time we were working in a little cubby hole of an office halfway up some stairs at Television Centre. But before long they built a purpose-built office on the roof of the 7th floor, a kind of prefabricated office, which was great. It gave us plenty of room. But unfortunately there was no air conditioning or heating. So in summer it was heated up like an oven, and in winter it was like a refrigerator. Neither of those conditions was very good for the computer, the original computer that we had running there, which would tend to come to a halt many times in one day.
Initially, the thing that transmitted teletext was called a core store, and it was only capable of holding 20. It was actually 30 pages, and then the next stage in development for Ceefax was that they actually had a purpose-built computer sitting in the Ceefax newsroom, and about the same time the BBC allocated room 7059 on the very top floor of Television Centre as a dedicated Ceefax newsroom and production office. But the first computer was stuck in there, but we were using visual display units created by a company called Lean Shear. Huge, great green metal things. They weren't very well earthed, so if you touch the casing at the wrong time, you get a belt off it. And I don't know whether that had any impact on the transmission system, but it was called Esmeralda. That was Colin's name for it. He came up with it. I don't know why Esmeralda, but it developed teething problems. It would just stop working, basically. It would stop updating pages. The pages would still be going out, but they weren't being updated. And the only way you could get round that was to walk round the back of the production terminals and push the reboot button on Esmeralda and wait about 4 minutes while it rebooted, and then everything would start up again. Whatever the problem, I never did know what the problem was, but it got worse and worse and worse. And another sub-editor called Ian Irving and I used to take it in turns to walk round there and push the reboot button. And on one fabulous occasion, we did it dozens and dozens of times in one day. And I think if I'd had a hammer,
you'd have rebooted it.
I would have rebooted it permanently. Yeah. And I think partly as a result of that, the BBC then had realised that Ceefax was going to be a major medium, and they commissioned a company called Logica to design and produce a pucker teletext transmission system.
Like any news service, Ceefax depends largely for its output on news agencies. Here we have a teleprinter from the Press Association, and here we have the BBC's own news service, General News Service at Broadcasting House. The sub-editor, when he wanted to get some news, would tear off the paper and then walk over to the visual display unit, which is simply a television monitor linked electronically to a typewriter keyboard and then onto the computer.
And it was called a rip and read, the main news bulletin. And literally you do that, you'd rip it off, take it back to the terminal, read through the stories. If there was anything new on a story that we already had on air, then you'd update it. If there was a new story, obviously that would take priority. And then you had to try to work out, as a sub-editor, where you were going to fit it into the transmission sequence. So there might have been a story about, think of an example, about something that had happened in Antigua, which had been big news earlier in the day, but had gone down the importance of the news stack. and you get a news story coming in about a fire in Bradford, for example, which would replace that story. So you put the Bradford story up at the top, shuffle all the other pages down, and retransmit the whole thing. So the broadcast magazine, they were called magazines right from the beginning, was always changing.
For it is in remembering what we share of the past that our two nations can make common cause for the future. If developments like the Industrial Revolution, which began here in England, and the gifts of science and technology have made life much easier for us, they have also made it more dangerous. There are threats now to our freedom, indeed to our very existence, that other generations could never even have imagined.
We started to get people coming in from all over the world to see what Ceefax was doing. And Colin McIntyre or I or Ian Irving would show people around and explain what we were doing. And we were on duty, myself and another sub-editor called Peter Winter, when a gentleman called Benjamin Barton Smiley III from Texas came over to attend a conference on behalf of his boss, Marshall Field, who owned the Chicago Sun-Times newspaper, a couple of other newspapers in other cities, and 5 UHF TV stations. So he had the broadcast medium, he had the news services for the newspapers, and Marshall Field had seen Ceefax and sent Smiley over because he said, we could do that, we could be the first people in the United States to have a similar service. So we showed Ben around. About a month after that, he came back and went to Logica and said, I'd like to buy a contact system, please. And they nearly fell off their chairs because it was worth a lot of money. And then he contacted Pete Winter and myself and said, would you like to come to Chicago to help set up and run the first commercial teletext service in America?
Welcome to Night Owl, your late-night news and information program from Keyfax. Keyfax is an innovative information service which features the latest news, sports, business, weather, and entertainment. Night Owl blasts off at 12 midnight every night on Channel 32, WFLD Chicago.
Keyfax, the service in Chicago was called Keyfax, obviously
Keyfax,
a steal from Ceefax. It was a UHF TV station, which basically every city has at least one or two of these UHF TV stations. But because of the tie-in with the Chicago Sun-Times newspaper, basically they had that as a mechanism to publicise the fact that they were offering teletext. And they did a deal with Zenith Television.
Although I think they pronounced it Zenith.
Zenith, that's right. And they started making teletext-equipped televisions. And we recruited journalists. We had a sports editor, a financial editor, myself as managing editor, Pete as managing director of the service, an advertising sales team. They were employing about 40 people fairly quickly, fairly early on. Because there were relatively few teletext sets out there initially, they decided, it was WFLD channel 32, and that was on air from 6 in the morning until midnight, but nothing was going out overnight. So they said, well, can you do teletext in vision overnight? And we said, yeah, we can do that. So Night Owl was the result of that, and that was a 6-hour rolling teletext news service. So we worked 24 hours a day through the night, putting up news, sport, financial information from all over the world, not just from Chicago. There was a big Chicago local element to it, but it had elements from all over the world. And they were 20-minute orbits, they were called. And each one had a little animated graphic at the beginning of it. So there was a rocket taking off, a bird coming out of a cuckoo clock, a submarine surfacing, all sorts of different things, most of which I created out there. And that was just great fun. It was fantastic fun. But it was very hard work. And it was just starting to take off, teletext in the States. I was offered the chance to go and run a different teletext operation in Cincinnati, which was going to be called Electra, run by Taft Broadcasting. And I decided I didn't want to move to Cincinnati. So there were then 2 teletext services operating. I think ultimately there were about 5. And that's when Colin McIntyre, who had retired from Ceefax, contacted me to tell me that a new company called Intelfax Ltd had won the contract to provide teletext for Channel 4. So I asked him quite a few questions about it. I had an interview for the Intelfax job in Chicago and said yes. And I came back. I said yes, I'd come back and run Intelfax. One of the guys that we employed on Intelfax was a chap called Stephen Rosenberg, who came straight from college. He was a very young lad when he joined us as a reporter, as a sub-editor. And he was fluent in Russian and decided after a while that he'd really like to go and experience life in Russia. And he came to me and said, look, I'd like to go over there and see if I can sell an Atom teletext transmission system. Would you let me have one? And he went to a company called Ostankino in Moscow and installed an Atom teletext transmission system and was responsible for producing teletext for Ostankino for about 3 years. But he then re-emerged as the BBC's Russia correspondent, and he is now the BBC's Russia editor.
I finished my course, my Russian course, up in Leeds, and I went out to Moscow to work in August 1991. And my first job was teaching English at the Moscow Machine Tool Construction Institute. And then suddenly the Soviet Union fell apart about 4 or 5 months after I arrived in Moscow. So that was unexpected. There was lots of news, obviously, and I got a job with American television just in the evenings answering the phone.
Good evening. In a week of remarkable developments, another stunner tonight from the Soviet Union. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev announced he is resigning as head of the Soviet Communist Party and recommended that the party's ruling Central Committee be disbanded, which in effect would mean the end of communist rule in the Soviet Union.
Do you know, in Soviet times, of course, there were no teletext decoders in Soviet television sets, which tended to explode. I think exploding television sets was one of the main causes of house fires. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, then you had Western electronics coming into Russia big time. So eventually, yes, televisions with teletext decoders were on the market. And then I discovered that at the Moscow TV tower, they were doing experimental broadcasts, teletext broadcasts. So I went to the Moscow TV tower one morning and managed to get in and meet the man who was in charge of their teletext experiments. He was really surprised to see me. This kind of Englishman had popped up at the Moscow TV tower asking about teletext. Anyway, when I said that I'd worked at British Teletext, he was suddenly quite interested. So he introduced me to his team and he showed me the equipment. It was all very basic stuff. And I'm not quite sure how it happened, but they offered me a job doing like a proper service. So I created Mostext, which was like Russia's first teletext service. This was part of the Moscow TV tower. So that was fun, but that lasted about 3 months, 3 or 4 months. And some friends came to help me with that, and we created Mozzie. You know, like 40 had the dog as the emblem. Yeah. So we created Mozzie for Mostext, this Russian bear, which was quite fun. So at that point, I thought, right, no, I need to do this properly, or as properly as I can possibly try. So I set up a company and managed to negotiate a deal with Russian state television. You know, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and Russian state television was kind of the new channel to represent independent Russia, the new Russia. I got a deal with them to do the first proper regular teletext service. I got some funding from the European Union, which allowed me to buy some equipment, some teletext equipment from Intelfax. Some university friends came over to help me, and we set up in a room at Russian state television to do, I think it was 3 teletext services. There was Ertel, which was the Russian language one. There was Artel, and there was an extra one, I think Eurotel, for the European Union. So there we were with a couple of keyboards, and we had an Atom from Intelfax, and I did this for a year. And The one thing I learnt at the end of it was that I am not a businessman. We didn't earn a penny. We didn't earn a penny. And the funny thing was that all the kind of the senior officials at Russian state television who kept poking their heads around the door, they must have thought, oh, look, there are some foreigners. They must be earning millions and millions of dollars or pounds or whatever. We weren't earning anything. We were just losing money. But it was such fun to do these teletext services. We did news. We did travel reports. We did weather. There was a fun page, of course, with his jokes. It was just enormous, enormous fun. But sadly, inevitably, I realised that, oh, my pockets are empty. I can't carry on doing this because it's a financial disaster. And I realised I had to get myself a proper job, a regular job. So I eventually went back to American television, to CBS, and got a kind of a regular job there. That led to the BBC in Moscow in '97, where I became a producer and then a reporter and a correspondent. And I've been with the BBC ever since. But I always look back with great fondness at my days trying to make it with Russian teletext. And it's a fun story to tell people. Very few people know, actually.
Oracle is ITV's very own information service. News, sport and travel can be delivered at the touch of a button. Jokes, letters and the latest pop news. Oracle. 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 Oracle.
Page the Oracle.
Page the Oracle.
Meanwhile, the UK's other teletext service, Oracle, had been broadcasting since 1978. Here's Gareth Herrings, writer of the teens feature Debbie's Diary.
It was so accessible. I mean, I think Oracle could reach something like half the population, via TV, teletext TV sets. It was absolutely huge. Adrian Mole was probably fairly big at the time. I suppose a lot of the inspiration came from that. But also, I think there was actually a good reason for doing it, and that was we wanted to encourage more girls to read Oracle as well. So a diary based on a teenage girl seemed like a good idea.
Becky phoned today. I told her to get stuffed. She called me a bloater and I told her she's an airhead. We gassed for a bit, but it was cut short by Mum going on about the phone bill, yet again. She said I shouldn't waste other people's money if I wasn't prepared to earn any myself. I don't know. You take one day off work sick and suddenly you're a sponger.
In my garage, I have an archive, a Debbie's Diary archive, which is actually a small suitcase stuffed full of printouts from Debbie's Diary. But in that suitcase, I found the letter that was sent to the Broadcasting Standards Council, which were the sort of Ofcom of their day. The letter of complaints, which led to, unfortunately, us getting a reprimand from the Broadcasting Standards Council. We didn't have to take Debbie's Diary off air, but we had to put it on after the watershed. So it went on at 9 o'clock at night instead of whenever it used to go on before. It starts like this. I think it kind of, in some ways, says it all. Dear Sir, do you honestly believe that you are doing our young people a service by allowing all that filth and immortality to be disseminated over your buzz programme? ? Do you not have any qualms whatsoever? ? Some of us are doing our best in the schools to train up youngsters in the way of clean living and clean thinking, to say nothing of work done by the Scout and Guide associations, only to have their minds corrupted by this gutter filth and language which even upsets some of those to whom it is directed. So it's quite strong stuff. Interestingly, I also found a letter from one of the people who thought Debbie's Diary should have stayed in its original time slot. It's quite interesting from a sort of cultural point of view, I think, because it gives you an idea of how Debbie's Diary divided people. This is from a lady near St Albans who has got 3 teenage daughters. She's been a teacher of teenagers and she was at the time a magistrate. And she's saying, I'm writing to request that you return Debbie's Diary to its previous time slot, as I disagree most strongly with those people who think it's unsuitable for children to read. she goes on to say, I really do not feel that there's anything on Debbie's diary that could possibly do any harm. It is necessary to read the diary. There is nothing visual which could disturb, and what they don't understand will go over their heads. I doubt there is anything that you don't hear about at school, and Debbie seems to be a normal 15-year-old girl. So that gives you a bit of an insight into the times.
And the times, they were a-changing. Oracle were to lose their licence and close at the end of 1992.
When Oracle lost the franchise, we had a kind of, I don't know how many months, probably 6 months or so to sort of wind down the service in a way. Well, you can imagine it was devastating. We were like one big family, really. And in fact, I met my wife, my future wife at Oracle, and we're still together 30 years on. So that's the kind of place it was. But yeah, we were devastated when we lost the franchise. We couldn't understand how it was that Teletext UK, at the time, the consortium, how they'd bid so much, basically, more than anybody else.
Secretary Douglas Hurd published the government's blueprint for the future of British broadcasting today, a future in which the viewer may have a choice of several dozen TV channels and the listener of several hundred radio stations. In presenting his white paper, he set out the steps which will take Britain's TV and radio into the 21st century. There'll be many more local TV stations. The ITV regional franchises will be auctioned off in 1992.
Spearheading the new services on Channel 3 and Channel 4 was former Ceefax duty editor Graham Lovelace.
That was a major landmark for the television industry in the UK. Back then, all of the ITV franchises were being auctioned. This was legislation that was put in place by the then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. One of the TV licenses that was up for auction was known as the public Teletext license. Now, Teletext at that time, Oracle we're talking now, was owned by the ITV companies. And ITV back then was a federation of 15 individual companies. Each of those licenses were then up for grabs, plus the Teletext license. So even at Ceefax, we were reporting the television license bids as a story. The bid that came from Associated Phillips and Media Ventures. Media Ventures was a venture capital company that helped put together that consortium. That consortium bid £8.2 million a year for the privilege of running the public Teletext license. That was far more than many of the television franchises went. I think Central won its license for £2,000. And many people, including half the newsroom at Ceefax, felt that they had overbid, that this was not going to have a happy ending. But I was starting to see things in Press Gazette, the magazine for journalists, certain people from the Teletext operation, backed by Associated, obviously the publisher of the Daily Mail, Mail on Sunday. They were talking very, very positively about their ideas for this medium, for the Teletext medium. And the fact that these were big organisations, big successful organisations, Associated Newspapers, Philips Electronics, the consumer electronics giant that had helped invent the Teletext chip. This was a brilliant marriage of content and technology. Now, little did I know that in the Ceefax newsroom was someone that had been advising the Associated team. And that person came over to me on the day that we wrote this story about this consortium winning the franchise. And he took me to the BBC bar. And over a few drinks, he explained that he had been advising this other consortium and that he was leaving Ceefax. He was the mastermind of all the technology in the Ceefax newsroom. Brilliant guy, good journalist as well. And he said, you should join us. Just like that. And I thought, okay, that I'm happy here at Ceefax and this is a brand new startup. He said, yeah, it's me and 3 people. So I said, okay, well, I'll come and have a look at the operation. And of course, there was no operation, but I did. I went across to 101 Farm Lane in Fulham and I met somebody who was then the consultant editor of the service. And I met a couple of people from Associated as well. And they were very, very keen to know how Ceefax worked, what my ideas would be for the future of this medium, what I thought of their bid document, their application. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't think very much of it at all. They clearly didn't know very much about the medium itself in terms of the limitations of the medium. At one point, they even talked about black text on a white background, which I explained to them just wasn't possible on Teletext. But of course, they came from a newspaper world. This was a very, very important win for associated newspapers. Newspapers back then were not allowed to own TV franchises under British law. This was known as media ownership rules. But here they were sort of coming in. There was a sort of creeping backdoor route into something on mainstream television. And they said, come and join us, work with this guy. His name was John Home, lovely, lovely guy. You'd be John's deputy and you could put a team together. You can recruit whoever you want. We're launching in 6 months' time. Essentially, we're out to be not only Ceefax's biggest rival, but we want to show that this medium can be popular, that it can lead the daily discussion, can lead daily debate. And we want this to be a mass market service, which is absolutely fundamental because it was funded by advertising. And for that, we need a very large mass audience. All attention then went on how we were going to put a team together to create this teletext service in just 6 months. No holidays, no breaks, no weekends. I worked flat out every single day for 6 months. And indeed, everybody that we recruited did the same. I mean, it was just insane, the task that was before us. It felt like we were at the foothills of Everest and we were never going to make it beyond base camp. There was just so much to do. The name of the company. So I was then attending board meetings, and one of the early decisions that we had to make was a name of the company and the name of the service. Basically, there was about 5 of us that were almost locked in a room until we'd come up with a name. And we thought of everything, absolutely everything we could think of under the sun. And in the end, we went with the generic name of the medium. So it was Teletext Ltd, and the service then was known as Teletext on ITV and Channel 4. Teletext with a capital T. And the advantage of that is we did get a lot of the publicity. Anyone referring to the word teletext, they would refer to teletext with a capital T. So we wanted to be this sort of brand name, like when people say they're hoovering the carpet, or now let's Google that. The name of the service becomes the action, the activity. So yeah, we went live January the 1st, 1993. And as I walked in, I could hear one thing, and it was telephones ringing. It was viewers phoning in saying, where is my knitting page? Where is my shipping forecast? Why have you moved the news to Channel 4? Under the license, we had to listen to every single one of these queries and handle all calls in a very professional manner. And we had to log every call as well. There were thousands in the first week. Things settled down. People got used to the fact that page numbers, yes, had changed. But there was a group of people out there, a community of people for whom Teletext now and Ceefax was a lifeline, that this was a friend, people who couldn't sleep at night. And television went off air. There might be a test card on TV. The Teletext was still working. And they would sit and watch this. We had night watchmen, security people, cab firms, etc. This is all they had. But they were also phoning in for someone to talk to. And again, this was something which we had to take very, very seriously. And often the call would go to the centre desk and they'd say, can I speak to the editor? And just about every evening, if I hung around that operation after 7 o'clock, there were repeated calls from certain individuals. And these people were absolutely amazing. They were so knowledgeable about the teletext medium, and they knew everything about the service. And they were a font of all knowledge of how the thing might evolve as well. These were normal people around the country. And I remember one guy saying, I live in a flat. The neighbour's got this really, really horrible dog. It barks all night. Can you put something on their TV to tell their dog to stop barking? This was a serious call. I had people serving life prison sentences writing to me saying, could you help campaign for my release? People looked at Teletext as this life support, as a friend, as a companion, and we started to think, okay, let's really drill into this. So I had this idea that we would create viewer groups around the country, and that we would actually reach out to these people and they would become people that would provide feedback, but we'd actually give them a membership of something, and there'd be a community of people. And we had about, I think at one stage, about 10 of these. At one meeting, we had hundreds of people in the room.
Paul Rose, better known as Mr. Biffo, was part of the team that developed Teletext Limited's new service at the end of 1992.
I got a call from someone that I worked with at Ladbrokes, whose flatmate was working for Teletext, which had obviously landed the Teletext franchise from Oracle, and they were looking for a graphic designer. And I went, had a job interview, and that was it, really. And I ended up being, I think, initially, the only member of staff on an ongoing contract. Everyone else was on kind of short-term contracts, and I, such is the arrogance of youth, or rather, I think more in my case, the ignorance of youth, that they told me they were going to give me like a 3-month contract or 6-month contract, and I said, no, I don't want that. And they said, okay, can you wait outside a minute? And I waited outside of it was the editor and Graham Lovelace, who at the time was the deputy editor. And then they called me back in 5 minutes later and said, okay, we'll give you an ongoing contract. And I was the only person there with any kind of job security, because no one knew whether Teletext was going to fail or not. So so that was it, really. And then I was doing graphics at Teletext, in the run up to the launch. And what happened was they asked everyone, can you think of any sort of sections that we're missing on the service? And I pitched the idea of a video games page, which they currently then weren't doing, or they had a single page. And I suggested a magazine, this being 1992, going into 93, when, Sonic the Hedgehog was at his height, and, Sega and Nintendo were all over the media. And John Holmes, the then editor, said, all right, well, you can write it then with this chap that was writing for the team pages called Tim Moore. And so I ended up juggling doing the graphics for Teletext with writing the video game magazine, which we called Digitiser. Digitiser was a sort of very visual section. It was probably the most visual section on Teletext because I was working on it. So we always had these characters and these pages with huge graphics and things which no one else got. Everyone else would kind of come up to me and go, oh, quick, I need a icon of a palm tree, which is the classic, or a pelican or something like that. And, I'd knock that out and they'd stick that in the corner of their page. Whereas on Digitiser, we'd have these huge images of things with like tentacles coming out of their mouths and footballs for eyes and things. So, I just went to town with it. The big trouble was, for me, Teletext graphics didn't take me very long, which is why, the bulk of my day would be taken up with Digitiser, with someone occasionally coming across to me and saying, I need a graphic for this or a graphic for that. And, I'll do that, bash it out in 5 minutes, send it across to them on the internal messaging system, and then carry on with writing game reviews and messing about with Tim Moore. But, it sort of shows you that, because eventually I started doing Digitiser from home, full-time, effectively from home myself, without doing the graphics as well. When that happened, I was able to finish my day's work in an hour, which shows you sort of how much of my day was taken up with just messing around with Tim, because there was not a lot to do.
Yeah, it was like working in a boy's bedroom.
Sarah Scott Rivers, graphic designer in Teletext sales department.
I'm a middle child with an elder brother and a younger brother, so it just washed over me. They were not really nice to work with, but then I was moved to work downstairs with sales. They stuck the designers together for practicality, but then they decided I was better off located with the team I was supposed to be working with, so that's what happened.
Steve Horsley, graphic designer.
When I started working, it was great because I'd work up there with Paul. I'd be in the desk opposite. I'd watch them work and watch Digitiser being put together and everything else, and just the chaos. And it was amazing. And then I was relegated downstairs, and it's like I miss all that stuff upstairs. Everybody's so sensible down there. It was like a different world. It really was.
I loved doing Turn of the Worm. He was on the kids section. I just made them up as I went along. It was quite sort of sci-fi. There's some good gags in them. There were a lot of sort of parodies of things, like parodies of the X-Files and Doctor Who and Jurassic Park and stuff. And then we'd always have a Christmas episode. I love doing the Christmas episodes, or the Christmas storylines, which would always end exactly the same way, where it was Turn the Worm and his friend Glug the Slug. they'd always end up spoiling their Christmas dinner somehow, and then they'd get a knock at the door from Terry Turkey, and the last shot of them would be Turner and Glug eating Terry Turkey. No one ever complained. I mean, it was it was really macabre.
Believe it or not, Paul Rose's most controversial moments were yet to come.
Could you possibly be meaning the real turn of the worm? Yes, that's going to be on my headstone when I die, I swear to God. Get it banned from the cemetery.
It feels like I should end this sort of farewell thing with something apt. But how to sum up 10 gut-stuffed years in a few short words? It's impossible, and thus the only way to explain such feelings is with an image. Press reveal to see what it is. The real turn of the worm being sick.
Digi always was kind of a bit near the knuckle anyway. Early on it wasn't. I mean, we were just silly and surreal. But the sub-editors didn't always get our sense of humour and would sometimes read stuff into it that wasn't there. And the more they did that, the more we saw it as a challenge to get kind of slightly dodgy content in a very sort of nudge, wink kind of way. Because it was like, well, you think we're doing this stuff already. Well, okay, well, how about this then? And none of the dodgy stuff ever got taken off because they went over their heads. And that includes the real turn of the worm being sick, which was, my final graphic that I did for Teletext. Because I thought, I've got to do something memorable. Well, okay, let's have an ejaculated penis and say it's turn of the worm. But they're never going to pass it. I'll put it on the page and let's just see what happens. They're not going to say yes to this. This is going to be the one that they go no. But I just thought, I'll chance my arm because let's face it, what are they going to do? Fire me? It's like I've quit already. So I did it and then it went out. This big purple member with white vomit splashed all over the screen.
There's a channel you can turn on.
The real turn of the worm being sick.
24 hours a day. Turn on for the very latest information. Teletext. Information.
Well, that was weird.
Plus, the latest information on holidays.
The largest choice of flights and holidays throughout the world, from Britain to the Bahamas, from safaris to water sports.
In Tenerife, Playa de las Americas has shot up in a few short years.
With more destinations, more people have gone away with Teletext Holidays.
On some holidays, there may be price cuts. Well, worth checking, obviously.
You'll find app travel agents offering their best prices. All this on Teletext. ITV paid 200.
You want to get on Teletext? Get a cheap holiday off Teletext. I'm telling you now, get on there for a bargain. 200, yellow button if you've got fast text. Get on there.
Teletext holiday pioneer Graham Lovelace.
Oracle had this strange thing, though, that the holiday advertisers were only allowed to update their prices once a day. I have no idea why this happened, but there was no internal competition between holiday operators and the holiday companies and the flights companies. So we had this early idea at Teletext, what if we just remove that restriction and the advertisers could also update live, just as much as PA was updating our news services live. And that those advertisers would also have to take on responsibility to be legal, decent, honest and true. And if they're advertising a holiday for £15 in Greece for 2 weeks, that really does exist. But we then had to train all the advertisers in, if you're going to say something on this screen which is alongside a news page, the news obviously has to be accurate and truthful.
Did that holiday really go out for £5 a week? I think people have tried to buy those holidays, but I think there was a disclaimer somewhere that mistakes could be made because I was working there. don't trust the prices on those pages because you get to a point and you just see numbers.
Pixel palm tree aficionado Steve Horsley.
Yeah, every company wanted their own palm tree or their own boat or their own sunset. You couldn't reuse anybody else's. They would know it. They would come back and say, okay, I had my advert done. I want something different, but I want it this.
I want it like this, but different.
Yeah. And it would just be, you just have to change a couple of pixels. As long as you changed a couple of pixels, you're okay. because I think everybody wanted to know they had their money's worth. He was doing 30, 40 pages a day from scratch. I don't know how long I lasted doing that. I think I was only there for about a year before I went off to work for an advertising agency. I was doing the Teletext graphics, and they were basically exclusively holidays. So they had a lot of holiday clients.
And you didn't draw any naked girls then?
Well, that's what they all are, but the trouble is everyone in silhouettes. So everyone on the beach. I can honestly say I didn't draw a swimming costume on anybody in all the time I was there. Yeah, but if you'd have seen what was happening behind the palm trees.
Well, you go on, and it's like page 86 of 400 pages of holidays. That's something on there, Corfu. Like, oh, no, it's changed that now. Hang on, here's one here. 3 hours later, get it coming on again now.
The constant viewer niggle was, why have you got so many cycling pages? Why do I have to come in on page 16 of 93, which it never was. That was always an apocryphal story. But particularly with holiday advertising, for a particular destination, there would be dozens of pages cycling around. And if someone missed that page, they would have to wait. And the reason why they had to wait is there was no storage. We couldn't just pump out the service and it was captured by TVs and people could then scroll through the service. We had to keep on rebroadcasting it every 6 seconds, I think it was. All those thousands and thousands of pages.
Where, page 85, page 86, it's coming up now. Take them matchsticks out your eyes, get a pencil, it's coming on now. It's gone now, gone, it's sold, forget about it.
Imagine a world where every word ever written, every picture ever painted and every film ever shot could be viewed instantly in your home via an information superhighway, a high-capacity digital communications network. It sounds pretty grand, but it all comes down to computers communicating. And in fact, that's already happening on something called the Internet.
Teletext Limited's Paul Rose.
The Internet, I mean, it was fairly early on. I remember the guy who was the publisher of Future, was the top guy, came in, and I remember him saying, you guys need to get on the Internet, it's going to be big. We had in the office one computer that could access the Internet, and we occasionally went in there and tried to sort of get on a bulletin board, but it was really slow. And then gradually, the whole office got online. I remember playing some multi-user dungeon role-playing game on there when I was meant to be working during office hours. And the big changes came, I guess, when Teletext launched its website. They sent me off to sort of learn HTML and Photoshop and all of that. Certain people within the company felt that was the direction of travel, that Teletext was already starting to be sort of superseded by this new thing. Weirdly, even when they had their website, it sort of felt a bit like an afterthought to me. I just think back then, at least when Teletext started their website, it was still kind of very much a curiosity. I think we had our launch. I remember going to a cyber cafe, remember those? Because not everyone had PCs back then. I guess perhaps I didn't have the vision that some people did. I didn't think, well, this is going to be for everyone. This is just going to be for kind of nerds, which, is stupid of me, given that Digi was for sort of nerds and gamers and the exact same people who would drive the Internet to what it became. But I don't know. I think it was that. There were no smartphones and things, so the Internet wasn't universal like it is today.
Teletext editorial director Graham Lovelace.
So, of course, Tim Berners-Lee had invented the web, 1990, but it was only really known by a few nerdy individuals that had the ability, A, to understand HTML and B, download pages. But the Mosaic browser, that changed everything. Suddenly, you didn't need to know computer language, and these services were free, and that was a key thing, free. And I started to see that on these very, very sort of primordial version of the web, that some of our holiday advertisers were starting to experiment with going direct to consumers. The very advertisers that were paying a small fortune to appear on Teletext. These advertisers, by the way, had no premises whatsoever. They would buy their holidays on a spot market, generally late availability market, and then offload those holidays on the Teletext with a capital T service. If they could go direct to consumers, and if consumers could actually buy those holidays bypassing Teletext, then we were in trouble. And also, if people were going to then spend time using this newfangled web thing to get their news, their sport, etc., they wouldn't be spending that time with teletext either. But again, the sales model of actually advertising on the web was very, very different. It was based on people clicking banners. It was based on the number of people that you could expose those ads to. Whereas teletext was advertisers that would place holidays or racing odds on a page, and if those phones didn't start ringing at the end in their own offices, they knew there was something wrong. It was instant, absolutely instant. So we had to learn a completely new thing as well from the commercial operation. So suddenly we had Teletext and ITV and Channel 4. We were producing a teletext service on the back of a travel channel. So we had something called Traveltext. We had a service on the web. And then something else was coming down the tracks, which was digital television. And I remember the very first time when someone said to me, "Oh, you do realise that all of this is going to disappear, don't you?" And I thought they were talking about the web. And no, they were talking about digital terrestrial television.
Digital TV will multiply the number of channels on British television. It's being heralded as a revolution in broadcasting. You'll just need the small set-top black box which decodes the signal. It'll cost around £200.
The screen in the corner is no longer just the telly set, it's a service screen for the home.
The catchphrase is interactive TV, where the viewer is no longer a passive spectator, but an active participant.
It's a two-way street. Suddenly you're going to have a dialogue with your television. You can be in control of what you see. You might be able to even set your own schedules. You can call up what you want when you want. You can do your shopping from home. You do your banking from home. It's an incredibly versatile tool, and it's something that everyone, in my view, should welcome.
Where there was no VBI lines, there was no capacity as well. There wasn't even a license. So how on earth were we going to navigate this one? So this was another thing to have to get my head around.
This sea change in technology would prove the beginning of the end for Lovelace.
At the time, so we're now talking 98 going into 99, Sir David English died in 98, I think it was. His boss, the previous Lord Rothermere, died soon afterwards, about 3 months afterwards. So I lost my mentor at Teletext, and I was starting to get, quite frankly, sick and tired of constantly asking for more people to devise new services to help try and work out where we were going as a company. Teletext had been a 7.5-year commitment to me. It had been my entire career in the 90s, essentially, including Ceefax before. And it was a very, very, very big decision that I took it would have been December 99, announced to the staff, who had grown by then to over 300 people. I stood on the gantry at Farm Lane and I said I was leaving. And that was really, really hard. I mean, I'm even getting a bit emotional now, actually, even thinking about it. It was really, really hard, because I'd actually brought a number of people in. I'd helped them. They looked to me to take this medium into the future, and I was leaving. And I felt I was letting people down, but I couldn't continue doing. There was also a sense at the time, this was so, late 1999, the dot-com bubble was absolutely still as big as it was ever going to get. So it hadn't burst then, it burst in early 2000. And there were lots of people like me that were leaving big jobs to do their own thing on the web. In my heart of hearts, I knew I had to leave. And so I did. I left, and it was very, very difficult. And even thinking back and just reading back some of the cuttings to do this talk today, it takes me right back. Some things are pretty hazy 30 years ago. Some things are just as vivid as they were then. And I left, and it was even hard looking at the service. I couldn't even press that teletext button on the remote control for months.
This is BBC One. We've interrupted our programmes for a news report. We now go over to Martin Lewis in the news studio.
We interrupt this film to tell you we are getting reports that Diana, Princess of Wales, has been badly injured in a car crash in France. French radio is saying that the accident happened in western Paris when the car she was travelling in collided with another vehicle in a tunnel.
Gareth Herrings was feature editor at the BBC when the news filtered through.
Yeah, I was one of those people that got the call in the early hours to get into the office And we literally just had to clear most of our content in the features department. Obviously, we could keep certain things that were respectful, and we could have comments, people sending in their comments or whatever about how wonderful she was. But yeah, an awful lot of the slightly more flippant stuff had to go. That was quite a morning, and it took days really before the service got back to some sort of normality. So yeah, quite a time.
Mort and Judy Smith, now working for Intelfax, recall their experience.
I will never forget the week that Princess Diana died in 1997. I had been working all hours that God sent. Intelfax at that point was going through quite a difficult period financially, and there was quite a lot of infighting. It so often happens with companies. You start small, you grow, you get more successful, you grow, and then people who have not been there from the beginning start to change the course of the company, or try to. There was quite a lot of, not ill feeling, that's the wrong word for it, quite a lot of difficulty, I'll put it that way. And I was getting very stressed over quite a long period of time. And then Princess Diana died, and I had a phone call from the company secretary, Francis Colban. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning, I think, wasn't it?
It was.
To say she died, and that she'd had a phone call from Channel 4 saying they wanted to scrap all the subtitles that we had prepared, and they wanted to go live because they were going to change the entire schedule to cover the crisis, effectively. I got up and I went into work to try to help organise all of that work going on. I think I worked for 2 days solid. I didn't come home.
You went in, it happened on the Sunday night, you went in on the Monday and the Tuesday.
And I was just absolutely exhausted. I don't remember exactly what happened. What I do remember is sitting on the floor in the corner of my office crying because I just had a complete breakdown. And I was signed off by the doctor with clinical depression. I stayed away from Intelfax for
4 months.
4 months. And I went back, and I shouldn't have done. I should have just called it a day there. Struggled on for the next 4 years or so, and then ended up saying, I can't go on doing this anymore, I just have to leave and do something different. And left the company. Justin Jukes from Channel 4 had been an advisor after he'd left Channel 4. I got on really well with him, he was a really good guy. And the company said to him, will you take over as chairman? Well, Mort's not well. So he had. And I had several discussions with him. And Judy and I went into Channel 4 to have a meeting with Justin and with Francis Colban, the company secretary. And I thought it was just about me being made redundant, effectively. They said, look, we'll make you redundant so we can pay you a compensation fee. And what it turned out was that they were not only making me redundant, they were making Judy redundant as well.
Oh. I've been working for them for 10 years.
Yeah. Which came as a shock. And the date that we had that meeting was September the 11th, 2001. So we got home to turn the television on to watch planes flying into the World Trade Center. And it just felt like the entire world was collapsing. And after that, I thought I do need to do something completely different, hopefully stress-free. I was riding a motorbike at the time, so I became a motorcycle courier. And it was just such a release and a relief not to have to worry about running a company that at that point was employing 135 people, turning over £4.5 million, and all the pressure that brings with it.
Aside from Digitiser and Bamboozle, perhaps the most well-remembered section of Teletext Ltd service was Planet Sound. John Earls, editor from 2001, recalls its popularity among musicians.
There were musicians who were big fans of Planet Sound, but then there were perhaps unlikely musicians who loved Teletext. The classic go-to one would be Nicky Wire from Manic Street Preachers. He was an absolute Teletext obsessive, and Planet Sound being part of that. You know, he was always a great friend to Teletext and to Planet Sound, and he actually took great delight in telling me himself once, for whatever interview it was, where he was meant to be nominally talking about the latest Mannix album, where he kind of started the interview by saying how much of a dump he thought the Clarence was, the hotel owned by Bono. Not, you know, it's all very lovely and all very frou-frou, but it did not have Teletext in there, so Nicky just immediately left the hotel and went to stay somewhere else. And he apparently wrote Bono quite an angry email. I don't know what Bono's response to this was, probably slightly startled, but yeah, he really did write to Bono to say, how dare your hotel not have Teletext in there. I think it's important to remember that, you know, you had entertainment figures, and I think it was the same for some actors as well, for the TV and film pages, that if they weren't on tour or working on a TV show, they'd be at home just sat in front of the TV like anyone else, really. And of course, part of that would be watching Teletext. So you had some unlikely people who would just sit there reading Teletext the same as the rest of us. So yeah, Nicky Wire was a good one. Robert Smith from The Cure. Robert was a funny one insofar as Robert doesn't do many interviews. And of course, if you're saying, yeah, but I know I've heard that Robert Smith reads Teletext, any publicist is going to go, yeah, of course he is, and, you know, kind of keep you very much at arm's length. But eventually, like for the Cure album that came out, I think it was 2008, 413 Dream, we eventually persuaded the Cure's publicist to get us Robert on the phone for 15 minutes. And once Robert found out it was for Teletext, it was like an hour later by the time he was just like, right, okay, I've got to go now, you know, because he was just like, oh my God, I'm talking to Teletext. There's a certain mindset of certain musicians who I think regarded talking to Teletext as an entity as being quite a spacey thing to get your head round. I'm talking to the TV, literally, and I think that appealed to a certain mindset of musician, you know. I didn't see the letter in question or the email in question, however it was that Robert got in touch with us, but I was told convincingly that he wrote into Teletext for his own recipe for carrot cake, not kind of saying I'm making a big deal of it, but just we had a reader's recipe page, and it really was Robert Smith from Crawley, where he lives, and yeah, his recipe for carrot cake just appeared without any fanfare on, you know, whatever page the cookery pages were on. So yeah, I can well believe that Robert Smith's recipe for carrot cake, if only Teletext wasn't so ephemeral, is out there somewhere.
Now, one of the music industry's best prizes is, of course, the Christmas #1. And today, there were several new releases aiming to topple Sir Cliff Richard, who's been at #1 for some 3 weeks. The question is, will he be beaten by the singing hamsters?
But could a bunch of yodeling hamsters beat everyone to the top? The idea came from a hugely popular website. A band called the Cuban Boys sampled it into what may prove the most irritating but irresistible single this Christmas. John Andrew, BBC News.
Ricardo Autobahn of the Cuban Boys, best known for the hamster dance song, is another such musician who owes his success to Teletext.
Somebody had written a letter into Planet Sound saying, we're starting a fanzine. Is anybody out there like 80s music, synthesized music, Gary Newman, ZTT, that sort of thing? So I sent them a tape of the songs that myself and my sister had been recording on a little 4-track at home. And those people starting the fanzine were called Screen B and VL Underwood. And they lived in Eastbourne. And we sort of sparked up a friendship to the point that a year later, I dug out an old track I had recorded. I sent it to Screen and I said, why don't we form a band and release this? And it was a song called Cuban Boy, due to the fact that the sample was from a song called Cuban Boy. We sent it to John Peel. We come up with the name Cuban Boys off the top of our heads, in absence of anything better. And we rose to superstardom very, very quickly. Our campaign was based around the Teletext mainly. We based the entire Cuban Boys ethos around writing a load of fake letters to Planet Sound under various names. We worked out how to trick the computer into sending emails with various different responses so that you could fake your identity, as it were. So every day we'd send umpteen emails saying, oh, we heard this great song on John Peel. Oh, has anybody heard about the Cuban Boys? Oh, somebody's been at school has been talking about the Cuban Boys, and so on and so forth. And every day one would get printed, or every couple of days, and it snowballed into this mental sort of chaos whereby Stephen knew what was going on, I believe, fairly soon each week that we were gaming the system. And he got us on to do a full kind of interview thing, despite the fact we'd not released any records, and all we were really doing was sending CDs to John Peel, who was playing them happily. Our first proudest achievement was getting that sort of 5 or 6 page interview spread on Planet Sound, without really being a real band. The first interview we ever did with EMI on board was for Teletext, because we wanted to celebrate our roots. You're there with these huge offices and this great machine going around your ear going, yeah, we'd like to be interviewed by Teletext first, please. And they support it because they let us do it. They seemed a bit baffled by the whole thing. I don't know if they really understood the importance of the Teletext system for new music back then. Frankly, they didn't understand anything back then, quite frankly. In 98, when we were doing all the Teletext business, the hype all came from Teletext. I remember us getting a meeting at Virgin or something just because some guy had read about us on Teletext. They didn't ultimately sign us, but it was a real sign that people were paying attention to Teletext. You could get away with crackpot ideas. Nowadays, you've got to be a lot more creative in your thought and put a lot more effort in as well. I mean, if you want to become an internet star, you have to spend months just churning out TikToks until one goes sky high.
A group of dancing hamsters. In the sign of the times, it all started on the internet. This is what you can see if you log on to this particular web page. That soundtrack was so well liked, the entrepreneurs behind it have said, hey, let's make a pop record. Let's remix it and turn it into this. It just makes you want, doesn't it? I don't know. We'll be back with more in a moment. Do stay with us.
At the turn of the century, teletext remained the most popular method for sports fans to stay up to date on a Saturday afternoon. And in one case, a football player answered an advert on Ceefax with great success. Ceefax sports editor Ian Westbrook picks up the story.
With their secret Ceefax Striker on the bench, Wycombe travelled to Filbert Street to take on high-flying Leicester City in their quarter-final.
There was also the famous Roy Essendoe, the Wycombe striker. Now, I actually took the call that day from Wycombe's press officer who phoned us up and said, look, they were in the FA Cup quarter-final, so they're really short of players. Is there any way you could put a paragraph on your news in brief page saying we need a striker? So we put this up, and Roy Essendoe's agent saw the story, and he signed for Wycombe and scored the winning goal for them against Leicester, simply because they'd read that paragraph on Ceefax.
It is! It's Essendoe! The player who's only on a week-to-week contract! This is an incredible story!
So some of the other things that happened were Glenn Huddle's daughter once sent in a fax defending her dad after he got a load of stick when he was England manager. And also, one year I was at the Open Golf and a player accused us of misquoting him. I won't name the player, but what used to happen was they'd hold press conferences for some of the players, particularly in the last couple of days, but they couldn't do it for everybody. So what used to happen was that the officials would interview certain players at the end of their rounds, rather than having a press conference, and print out the quotes and put them in a tray at the back of the press tent. And you could just go and get a copy of whichever ones you needed. So we wrote up quotes this particular player. I think he said something like, disappointing finish, and he was going to take a rest and not play in the next week's tournament. Anyway, half an hour after we published the story, there's a tannoy announcement saying,
something from Ceefax comes to the front desk, please.
So I went to the desk, and this player's agent was standing there, and he said, look, he's read your piece, he's very unhappy, that's not what he said at all. So I brought the guy over to our desk and handed him the printout and said, well, he did say this, here's what he said, and we've correctly quoted him word for word. And Beck apologised because his player had misinformed him and we hadn't done anything wrong at all. One of the big motivations away from outside broadcasts was the rivalry we had with ITV Teletext. Obviously, we were doing the same thing, and the big motivation was to get stories up before they did. Obviously, not making things inaccurate in our rush to get things up. For example, say a manager was sacked or a game finished or a signing was made. We used to have on two big TVs in the office, our headlines page 301, their headlines page, I think it was 140. And the big joy was getting the story out first, beating them to the story.
Sadly, that rivalry was soon brought to an end.
Now, another story heavily discussed online today is the disappearance of teletext from our TV screens. From January, viewers on ITV, Channel 4 and Channel 5 will no longer be able to access the text-based news service. Bosses at the company blame the growth of the web for its demise.
Teletext John Earls.
I hope what other people are saying is that it was a fun place to work, because for those 10 years, I had stand-up rows with bosses the same as anyone else would, but it was a great, great place to work because you were left alone to do what you wanted. And if you were left alone, you were able to develop your own voice. much more freely than you could on any newspaper, where of course you'd have to be part of that newspaper's voice to a greater or lesser degree. But at Teletext, it was almost like John Sage, the editor, he was great for just having the faith in the writers that he employed to let you do you. To be fair, actually, that also, I'm thinking of other colleagues who ran other sections, that as well as the entertainment section, I went for like the health section, the environment section. There were all kinds of sections that built up their own established voice because of the seriousness that one individual journalist would bring to that section. And I can't think of anywhere, certainly not anywhere, that as niche as Teletext was, or as niche as Teletext is viewed now. We had millions and millions of viewers at its height, and we were lucky to do so. But it was a good product, man. I can't remember exactly how much notice we were given, but to be fair to Teletext, we were made aware quite early on that 31st of December 2009 would be the final switch off for Teletext editorial. And we certainly had enough notice that I remember the last week, or possibly even the last month, we ran a series of special interviews with people that we championed on Teletext and got messages from them for the final days of Planet Sound. So those would be people like Elbow, people like Kaiser Chiefs, people like Razorlight, that they were able to kind of say, thank you very much. And I remember writing a kind of big emotional farewell from my persona as the Void, the music letters page section. There was certainly a message from there. But yeah, it was certainly the case that we were able to celebrate it properly. I think it's fair to say that we had messages from various musicians that were saying their farewells to it and their thank yous to it. Yeah.
And sadly, the world's first teletext service was soon to follow.
8:25. It's been the friend of insomniacs, shift workers and news addicts for 38 years. Today, though, marks the very last day of the BBC's information service, Ceefax.
Yes, viewers in Northern Ireland will be the last to see the analogue service in action as they make the switch to digital television this week.
Ian Morton-Smith.
I started at Ceefax in 1974 and I stopped working for Intelfax in 2001. So, 27 years of my working life was all wrapped up in teletext. And that mug, the Ceefax mug, was when they actually pulled the plug at Television Centre to turn the last Ceefax service off in 2012, and they invited me to go back and watch what was happening. I think the rationale behind it was that they were going to put all their energy into providing a digital service on the new digital output. But as far as I'm concerned, they could just have kept Teletext going and digitised it effectively, which is what a lot of other people have done. And you still have had the same benefits of being able to get to a page quickly. I suppose their argument was, well, if people want that information that quickly, they can get it through the internet. But it did seem like a retrograde step to me to turn it all off at that point.
Ian Irving.
I think, it was an evolutionary thing. Obviously, the internet had taken over in many ways, but I still found the red button text service on the BBC was useful, doing much the same kind of thing as Ceefax had been doing, although not on the same scale.
Teletext John Earls.
There's 1,000,001 stories and 1,000,001 different takes about why Teletext didn't go online, didn't make best use of digital technology as it could have done. My own particular take on that is that effectively Teletext gambled on digital TV. It was almost like a red or black choice between digital TV and the internet, and Teletext bet the farm on digital. And in retrospect, that was of course the wrong choice. That's kind of my memory of it, but how accurate that was in reality, not for me to say.
However, this is not the end of the story. Britain's flagship analogue teletext services might have been consigned to history, but teletext itself remained alive and well across Europe. What's more, digital artists were beginning to recognise the potential of teletext as a creative medium. In 2006, Paul B. Davis of art group Lectrolab organised the influential VBI Microtel project broadcast on Dutch service NOS.
Me and my partner at the time, Emma Davidson, were asked to be in an exhibition, part of the Rotterdam Film Festival, at the Witte de Wit Center.
Well, my wife and I, Emma, have some projects here at the Witte de Wit Center, and one of them is a piece, Hack Nintendo cartridges. Then there's some kind of political component to a lot of it, like getting around the proprietary corporate protections of the machine and opening up the machine to be used for art and to be used in a more public and, to me, sort of social way. It's like this art medium, delivery medium, sitting in everyone's house that you can't really do anything with, you know what I mean? Because it's too expensive to start developing for it, and it's a closed system, so that's the attraction to me. I mean, I always like to, you know, just be a dickhead and like...
The point of the exhibition was asking about alternatives to a sort of renewed potential of television. They sort of said, you guys can do whatever you want, make a new work for the exhibition, but it's probably good if it has something to do with TV and you do something in a unique way. So we thought about it and just thought, well, why don't we do something with teletext? What we started to learn is actually teletext wasn't a particularly open format. If you actually wanted to make something, you kind of had to pay a lot of money, and the only people who could afford the software were TV stations, and that was on purpose. So I suppose the artistic intention behind this potential work became not how could we make a specific thing, but how might we unlock teletext for anyone to make something, because right now anyone can't. Yeah, that's how we came up with the idea of maybe we can make our own teletext TV station of some kind. We found Ceefax off some like archive site of a Polish television broadcaster or something like that. It's not open source, but it was the only freely available teletext software I could find. Yeah, we found Ceefax, and that became the project, is making an open call. People made stuff, sent it to me, I converted it, and sent it to NOS to broadcast. NOS gave us 5 or 6 pages to use, and it ran for, I'm going to say 2 weeks. We were in Rotterdam for a long time. We also gave workshops in the gallery, lots of them actually. So we would teach people how to use Ceefax. We gave tutorials, you know, we had people making pages, and then if anyone after a workshop wanted to, they would just submit it and put it in the pool of public submissions to be broadcast by NOS. And I mean, we got several hundred, I would say. Certainly we had way more material than we had time to broadcast the material. And we continued to get many, many submissions after the project was ended.
One digital artist influenced by this project was Dan Farrimond.
I found something called the Ceefax Teletext editor, and I experimented with that because there was a project called Electrolab Microtel for the Rotterdam Film Festival. And I was a little bit too late for that, but I managed to do some experimentation. The most important thing is that it was a lot of fun. I sort of dropped teletext art until 2012, I think early 2012, when I saw a call out for something they were calling the International Teletext Art Festival.
Teletext Art Festival is organized by Fixabay Cooperative in collaboration with YLE, the National Broadcast Corporation of Finland. The works will be shown on YLE teletext pages the 8th of March 2012, the 8th of April 2012, and presented in the one evening teletext event the 8th of March.
That would have been around about the time when I started taking it seriously, because I was still experimenting in my artworks that I sent, but they had more of a purpose because they were going to be shown on real teletext, which is, I think, still a great motivation for me. So I submitted about 10 pages and was very surprised when they showed them all on odd text, I think. Well, it was certainly shown on YLE text, and quite probably Germany as well.
Paul B. Davis.
2012 or 2013, I was invited to be a judge on something called the Internet Teletext Art Competition or something like this. That was super fun, and next year I submitted an entry myself. And actually, the reason that I found out about it and was asked to be a judge is because one of the organizers got in contact and said they wanted to use Ceefax off the archive download link and to put it on their site, and that was, of course, fine. And they wanted to use my tutorials on that site to tell people how to contribute work to the competition.
Inspired by the burgeoning teletext art scene, Dan Farrimond hosted a collaborative teletext art event with Tape Britain in 2015. It would be the first in a series of meetups dubbed Teletext Block Parties.
The Teletext Block Party in 2015 at Tape Britain. It was a very memorable day. I think about it all of the time. All the people that turned up to it, enthusiastic about teletext and learning about it. That was a real influence and an inspiration. I was approached, and I believe they found my work on Tumblr and asked me if I would come and give a presentation, along with about 3 or 4 other people who could potentially exhibit at Tape Britain at this Late at Tate series of events. So I travelled half the distance of the country from Wigan to give this talk, and thankfully they loved it. I kind of hogged the spotlight a little bit because you were only supposed to have 6 minutes, but they were all so enthusiastic about it, and I kind of got the feeling that they wanted to do it regardless of how well my presentation went.
Meanwhile, an amazing piece of technology was being developed to capture teletext services from domestic videotape. Jason Robertson, operator of teletextarchive.com, is one of the pioneers of teletext recovery.
Because I got this TV capture card. I ran a website, didn't I, in the late 90s called SubTV. It's still there, sub-tv.co.uk, and it's very late 90s if you go and have a look at it. Anyway, so we're in 2010. I was on Mike Brown's website because he got a website called Teletext Then and Now, and he got like a few screenshots of teletext pages, and it was, a nice site to go and have a look around. Mike's website had a supporting mailing list, the Teletext Then and Now mailing list, and in 2011, 2012, Alistair Buxton pops up saying, I've invented a way of getting teletext pages from videotape. It's like, what? You've got to be kidding. I think this is about 2011, and I thought, I'm going to try this out. I'm going to have to try this out because I got the capture card. I'm picking up teletext pages from videotape, and it's like, I've got a big raft of old VHS tapes behind me to go through, and it was like, wow, this is like amazing, because it was noisy. There was errors in the data, but it was just like, for this to even be possible at all is just mad. Because when you press text, when you're only just playing the videotape back and you press text on remote control, nothing happens. You might get the odd word, but nothing happens. So to get the data from that, it was like, well, this is obviously witchcraft or similar. That was amazing to do that. It works by pattern matching. It has a list of known patterns of teletext in there. So you could say, if I see this pattern of blur on a VHS recording, that corresponds to this data if it was clear. By using pattern matching, you can basically look at the blur on a VHS recording and it can pick out what the actual data would have been. It's not perfect. It can be perfect. On really clear recordings, you can get absolutely almost flawless data recovery from it. What the recovery quality comes out like, it never makes any sense. You can have the worst looking recording in the world and you can get brilliant results out of it. Like, long play video, for example, looks awful sometimes, but with some long play tapes you can get perfectly reasonable teletext out of it. It's like, why? And others, it can be just terrible. Teletext was a sort of a medium where it was broadcast and then it just went after that, because in the early days of teletext, they quite literally just overtyped the data and it was gone. There's no backups or anything of any data. But yeah, it was broadcast and it was gone, and it was just transient. It was here one day, gone the next. You could write something on teletext and it would be gone, and then that's, no one would ever see that again. You could hide your sins and Ceefax if you like. Now, of course, we can get it all back and we can see exactly. Well, so if we have just a recording, it doesn't have to, it's not like we used to have like pages from Ceefax where it was actually broadcast in vision, but it doesn't have to be that. It could be any domestic recording we can get teletext from. And I've been recovering teletext now for like over 10 years, so I almost have about 2,500 services in the archive just sitting on my hard drive.
And have you found the holy grail that you're looking for? I believe the first editor of Ceefax, Colin McIntyre, used to leave messages for his wife who'd be watching the Teletext page at home, this much fabled put the dinner on making my way back. Have we got closer to finding that yet?
No, we haven't. I suspect that will have happened very, very early on. I would imagine that he would have had, it wouldn't be a hidden page like as in, hidden data. It would just be a page that wasn't indexed. So it'll be a page in the service, say, I don't know, 184 or something, so his wife might dial 184 in on the set, and only she would know that number was there. It wasn't in the index, so 99.99% of people wouldn't have known it was there. So I suspect it's a sort of a normal page, but just not indexed. And I also think that would be really, really early on. You're looking at 75, 76, I would imagine that would be. And Teletext services from that period are very few and far between.
Throughout the medium's lifetime, various efforts were made to expand upon Teletext. The most well-known version of Teletext is Level 1, but Levels 2 and 3 were also developed in the 80s and 90s. Alistair Cree has developed a Teletext editor that supports these higher levels.
In about October 2016, that was when I started writing my Teletext editor. It was very inspired by Simon Rawls's EditTF site, because I was interested in the higher level teletext features, all the extra colours and so on. The basic teletext as devised in the 70s, and that's retrospectively been called Level 1, is just 40 columns, 25 rows. Each of those cells on the screen can be text or it can be graphics and so on. But to enhance that, they developed a system where things can be placed on the display without needing control characters to change them, so-called non-spacing attributes. The broadcasters, particularly the IBA, had done a lot of experimentation with these new techniques, and that was the extra colours and so on, and extra mosaic graphics and so on, was designated Level 2. There were more features and so on proposed and tested that were designated Level 3. But then none of that was really implemented because it would have taken very expensive electronics, so the television manufacturers weren't interested and so on, because it would make the sets cost too much. So it wasn't really taken forwards. All there were a few test broadcasts. But when the teletext specification was republished in 97, I think it was, as the enhanced teletext specification, some of the features from Level 3 had been added to the features from Level 2, and they designated, what they'd mixed it all together, they designated Level 2.5. The Level 2.5 from the late 90s onwards, that was implemented by a few broadcasters in mainland Europe. I think there's a Dutch broadcaster used it, and one of the German broadcasters, DF, used it. Not in any great amount, but it was at least broadcast, and television manufacturers began to implement the Level 2.5 features into their sets.
And now, 12 years after Ceefax was shut down, a faithful recreation is available. The man responsible for this feat is Nathan Dane.
We're talking Ceefax. In 2022, it has made a comeback thanks to Nathan Dane.
Nathan Dane, who's 20, has spent 6 years building a simulation of the BBC's text-based information service.
And Nathan Dane is the driving force behind it.
Nathan, I'm guessing, right, seeing as you are only, 20 years of age, you don't really remember Ceefax much, so your story really surprised me.
20-year-old Nathan Dane from Enniskillen, Northern Ireland, has recreated Ceefax and made it available for everyone to use, this time online.
Well, you can access it with anything with a web browser, pretty much. It's completely web-based, and the web-based part is all Alistair Cree's viewer, so it's amazing. But the actual content is what I do. Also, you can install it onto a Raspberry Pi and view it on a TV in the same way as the rail service was. I've always had a keen interest in analog technology, and especially TV and broadcast stuff. I got gifted a Raspberry Pi. There's like a competition in school that I won, and the prize was a Raspberry Pi. So I got this Raspberry Pi. My immediate next thought was, I want to have something useful on it. So this natural step for me was to try and recreate what I remembered, and what I remembered was Ceefax. I thought if I had something that was actually like useful information that was beneficial not only to me but to everybody else in my house. I know it's not a massive target audience, but there you go. From then on, I was sort of obsessed with it, really, and I've not stopped since. I was contacted by Jim Watterson, who's media editor at The Guardian. He wanted to do a story on Ceefax and me, who'd done it, for a sort of a Christmas/New Year's article, something fairly light and cheery for Christmas. I remember he specifically asked me, if we post a link to this, it'll be all right, will it? And I'm just like, well, yeah. And he's just like, yeah, it's not going to crash the website or cause any problems, is it? And I'm just like, oh, no, it'll be fine. So you can already guess where this is going. I host the entire system myself. At that time, the server that ran Ceefax was in my sister's house in Belfast on her internet. So when the article was released in January, the first I knew about it was when I got a message from, I think I got a message from the server, first of all, complaining about excessive load or something. And then I got a message from my sister to say, do you know anything about why the internet here is not working anymore? And I was just like, no. Yeah, that was when things really went nuts at that stage, because there's a couple of 100,000 people trying to get onto Ceefax from the Guardian website. And what was quite funny at that stage was I had all these reporters replying to my post and emailing me to say, would you do an interview with us as well? So I had to do, I think, pretty much most of the tabloids, at least, that come out daily. And I had a couple of radio interviews. Best one, or what I thought was really funny, and I still don't know how they found this out, but I was in work, I was in an office at a desk, and then my boss was at the table opposite me, and he had the phone on his desk. Phone rang, and it was reception, and Amy says, hi, George, I have somebody on from the BBC here for Nathan. So I had to go over and lift the phone and say, hello. And I don't know how they found out that I worked there, or how they found out that that was the phone number or anything, but they found out some way or other, and that was, they wanted me on Radio Ulster. So I was on Radio Ulster that evening with Jason Robertson. Oh, it was absolutely mental. And I know for a fact as well, from listening back to some of them, like, I was not ready for doing interviews. The first thing they always asked me was, Nathan, why did you create this service? And I was just like, for fun.
Why?
Well, because I suppose it's an interesting medium to work with. Like, I found that a really hard question to ask, because it's one of these things, and I said to somebody later, like, on the one hand, there's no correct answer for that, but at the same time, there's hundreds of reasons. So it's very hard to say for a radio interview, but fortunately, or I like to think anyway, by the last 2 or 3 of them, I'd sort of got a clue. I had to do Radio 2 with Jeremy Vine, and I had to do News Talk, which is a Republic of Ireland channel radio station, and had to do that with a fella, Sean Moncrief. And those were both longer form interviews. I think one of the problems with the first ones were you only had like 30 seconds or a minute, and you were very aware of that because you had them in your ear the whole time. So you knew that you were under pressure, and pressure can get to you sometimes, can't it? So whereas those ones, I knew I had a good 10-15 minutes, so I wasn't, and also I had experience of what everybody was asking, so I had a better idea what they were going to ask and what was going to happen. So that was my 15 minutes of fame.
And now, 50 years after its inception, creatives pay their tributes to Teletext in their own distinct ways. Here is Ceefax, a poem by James Domestic.
September 1974, Carl Douglas topped the charts, whilst the BBC blessed the maiden voyage of a young techno upstart. Whilst Carl was kung fu fighting at the summit for a time, a revolution started in room 7059. Heavy set and blocky fonts and vibrant violent hues imparting TV listings to weather, sport and news. With super chunky graphics and clunky animations, everybody knows the joy was in its limitations. Almost 40 years it lasted, a font of textual information, and 12 years since its closure it still has cult appreciation. Through the latter half of the Cold War, through Wilson, Callaghan and Thatcher, Major Blair, Cameron and Brown, the Eurostar, Diana. But its days were sadly numbered with the rise of the World Wide Web, which gave Ceefax a wedgie, Chinese burn and bloody neb. This sounds too small for both of us. Ceefax, you must be shelved. Ceefax knew the web had won and skulked off in 2012. Is it merely the pull of nostalgia, the ache of an old man's heart, hankering for the relics of youth, the deceit of a rose-tinted past, pining for a simplicity the modern world seems to lack? Perhaps I'll vote for Count Binface and bring old Ceefax back.
That's correct. Intergalactic space politician Count Binface, who has twice run for Mayor of London, is the foremost campaigner to bring Ceefax back to British screens in the space year 2024.
While some things do travel across the omniverse, radio signals have been beamed from your planet ever since they started being broadcast. And of all the things that us Sigma-Ninians have picked up, nothing has come close to the blocky, multicolored wonderment that is Ceefax. Ceefax is of its own, and it's a wonderful Earth invention, and as you can tell, I'm very, very keen to bring it back. Your news is gone completely up the spout because you live in a Ceefax-free planet. You're mad. It was doing a great job. You replaced it with the internet, which is a complete travesty, and it all went wrong from there. But again, I'm not saying anything controversial here. I'm just saying the truth. Ceefax rules, the rest of it, a load of old crap. Limitations? No. Just because something does a simple set of... The point is, something that doesn't do a huge amount doesn't mean it's limited. It's part of its wonderment. So, no. I say the whole point of Ceefax was it did what it said on the galactic cyber tin perfectly, and that's where everything's gone wrong because you humans got greedy. You wanted more. You didn't just want a news service that told you what it was and, had the odd viewer comment, but pretty well filtered. No. You needed to have social interaction, social media, everything being instant, everyone getting their say. What a load of bollocks. It's all gone wrong. So I don't say it was limited at all. It did exactly what it was supposed to do, and it actually did it properly.
But I think it is great that there is an interest in this quite quirky technology, because for ages people used to take the mickey out of me about, it's not really proper design, is it? And I'd think, well, people are paying me to do it. So, but now it's really, you get retro items in Paper Chase and it's all little squares. And I have a wry smile when I see an ad or anything that's remotely looks like 8-bit. Somebody did a Christmas jumper and I was looking at going, well, you couldn't have actually made that shape. But then my husband would just say, oh, really, Sarah, just get over yourself.
You tune in to some awful snow-covered TV programme with poor reception and try to work the teletext, but all that came up was this wonderful mishmash of characters, and sometimes words would transform into other words quite hilariously. My favourite one is from an old Ceefax hockey report, where somebody took a great shit instead of a great shot because the TV glitched up on that one particular letter, very unfortunately. That paints some very vivid pictures in the mind, as only Teletext can.
I'm pleased that there are people who remember it fondly, and although of course I feel my age when certain PRs who I work with now who are still in the industry are having to explain to young artists sometimes, like, John works at Teletext, you know, Teletext was blah 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 blah. You know, you're just like, don't even get, you know, don't even mention it to this poor 23-year-old artist who couldn't care less, you know.
It's been an incredible journey, really, but that Teletext decade was without doubt the most important and biggest thing I've ever done in my career. It's just wonderful that there's this group of individuals like yourself out there that still has this great affection for this medium that, you know, I miss. I still miss it. And the BBC's digital news service, which, you know, they keep on threatening to stop, isn't Teletext. And the fun we had with it as well, things like Bamboozle and the dating service that we had, you know, that dating service itself was another source of incredible stories, some of which I can never actually tell you. But, you know, people actually got married through that service, and then they started having children. I was actually invited to their weddings. It was incredible. So yeah, an amazing experience and an amazing set of memories, really. But the position of Teletext as an information medium, I think, it's in the minds of many, many people. Now I speak to people that are, you know, in their early 20s, and they'll say, "Oh, Teletext. Yeah, my uncle used to use that," or "My dad used to love it," or even "My granddad used to love it," and that takes me right back to being in my granddad's lounge.
This has been a Byte High No Limit illarterate co-production. Thanks to Pixelblip for some of the musical tracks used. Special thanks to everyone who has guested on Teletext People, and of course you, the listener.
So where does it go from here? Will Ceefax and Oracle still look the way they do today in 10, 15, 20 years' time?
I hope not. Goodness no. I mean, our big danger, I think, is probably complacency. We've reached a sort of plateau, our million sets, and the great danger is that everybody sits back and says, aren't we clever and wonderful? But I think it's a time for lateral thinking. I think that this is the time when people have really got to come up with ideas. We've established it, but the ideas have got to come, and they've got to come from young people using it quite differently. As well, Teletext should be part of video cassettes, video discs, satellites, cable, you name it. There's somewhere for Teletext in everything.